Just like to introduce Richie Merzian. He's the Director of Climate and Energy Program at the Australia Institute. And what's really interesting about Richie is that he's been to many COPs, quite a few of them as a government representative, and now, of course, he's there as in the non-government sector, and so that gives him perspective on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. So, and Richie's been at the COP since the beginning, and obviously has lots of interesting things to share with us. We just have a few questions, Richie, and I know that you'll have plenty to say anyway. But just as an opener, I'd be interested to know how successful has the COP been so far from your point of view, and are you hopeful of some good outcomes?
Well, thanks, Rod, and thanks CCL for having me. I'm coming to you live from my Glasgow apartment, which is probably, yeah, the weather is looking pretty depressing outside, but I'm feeling pretty hopeful about the COP. We've had about 6 days, started last Sunday, almost 7 really. I'm hopeful because for the first time ever, I've seen fossil fuels tackled directly at a UN climate conference. Like the political significance of COP26 is that it's nominally to ratchet up the targets put forward ahead of Paris, put forward ahead 6 years ago. And we've seen certainly more ambition from developed countries like the US, UK, the EU, Japan, Canada, South Korea. And we've seen a little bit more in terms of progress from some big developing country emitters like India, like Brazil. And that's all really good. But what the UK presidency has done is they've actually tackled fossil fuels directly, trying to consign coal to history, coal being the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions when consumed. And they had a big day for it, the Energy Transition Day, and actually announced new announcements with countries like Vietnam committing to no new coal power stations, countries like Indonesia actually looking at serious like restrictions on further coal growth. Countries like South Africa, which emits about the same as Australia, is the largest coal producer and user in Africa, actually coming up with a deal for it to phase out fossil fuels. So some pretty big things, and that was coal. Next week it'll be gas and oil. So like that I've never seen before. I mean, the Paris Agreement doesn't mention coal, doesn't mention gas, doesn't mention fossil fuels. But if we're going to tackle climate change, as the International Energy Agency says, we can't afford any new fossil fuel projects. So that's really impressive.
Great, thank you.
Something that couldn't be mentioned before can now all of a sudden become something that we can talk about, which is progress, I suppose.
That's right, Joyce. It was almost like taboo, like, oh, don't mention fossil fuels directly. But now you can actually just call them out by name, like Harry Potter.
That's a help. So what's, I guess from our point of view, what's the mood for carbon pricing in Glasgow and, of course, carbon border adjustments? I know on Tuesday there was a big panel that discussed this that was convened by Justin Trudeau and the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. I'm just wondering if that has kind of extended further out than just that side discussion that was had on Tuesday.
Yeah, there's been some talk, definitely. I think the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which rolled out this year in its final form, I think has definitely sharpened corporate minds to what it means to integrate a carbon price across their footprint. And I've heard border adjustments talked about. It's about time. It's the stick that we've long missed in climate negotiations, not just all the carrots. In terms of carbon pricing as a mechanism, there's been the usual side events, but I haven't heard too much more talked about it. However, having said that, there are, alongside the big trade show of all the events that the leaders are doing and everything like that, there are the actual negotiations that are taking place. And the negotiations on developing a new carbon market under the Article 6 the Paris Agreement is progressing, and the contours of a carbon market are coming to the fore. And obviously, by creating a pool of offsets or carbon credits that have integrity, you're taking one closer step to actually implementing some impost or regulation to ensure that there's a compliance market to purchase those credits. So that's good. We'll definitely know what that looks like next week. It's sort of a bit early days, given it's still highly contested.
I know they're talking about putting a floor price in place too, so that they had somewhere to start from. Yeah, thanks, Richie.
Now, research by the IMF and also your own Australia Institute indicates that subsidies to fossil fuels are very, very significant. And so I'm wondering, is there much recognition of these subsidies at the COP and the need to wind them back?
Yeah, I think it was ironic to hear Matthias Cormann, now as the head of the OECD, talk about winding back fossil fuel subsidies. Former WA senator, talk about winding back fossil fuel subsidies and the need for a global carbon price. So it's interesting who becomes the new champion for the cause. There is a bit of talk around fossil fuel subsidies. It's certainly a topic that rises up during the G20 as well. The G20, which just preceded COP in Rome. However, we haven't seen anything sort of more hard hitting on fossil fuel subsidies. Yes, our research shows there's over 10 billion each year that's handed out to fossil fuel usage and production in Australia. And really, you can't help but think what we could do with all that money if we redirected it elsewhere. And it's a similar footprint in many other developed economies. Hopefully, this gets more traction. We certainly have seen a bit more attention than usual.
Right. Well, as you know, we'll be trying to redirect most, or at least some, of those subsidies towards Australian households as the dividend. But of more immediate note, as you know, we've been pushing for the commitment to net zero, along with many other non-government agencies. And during that process, we've had 25 letters to the editor just in October, and we've had a dozen meetings with carefully chosen MPs and several hundred custom emails to MPs and lots of phone calls to MPs as well, all pushing for net zero. But we're also pushing for the target to be legislated, and we feel that that's really important. But interested to have your thoughts about how important it is to get net zero legislated in Australia.
Very, very important. I mean, the current plan by the federal government, the net zero by 2050, is a fraud, because fossil fuels flourish, right? Because there's no additional policies to actually see it through, because there's no accountability. There's no immediate impact. They don't see it having any immediate impact on our fossil fuel footprint. And new research by the Australian Institute shows that there's over 100 new fossil fuel projects in Australia, over 70 new coal mines, over 30 new gas projects. If they are all unleashed to their full capacity, that's about 1.7 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions that we add to the atmosphere. That's like 3 times Australia's national emissions. That's like over 200 coal power stations. So you can't allow net zero by 2050 to remain simply as a pledge, as a political aspiration, because it means it will not be reached. So yes, it does need to be legislated. I mean, look at the UK, they've gone from 40% coal power down to 2% in the last 10 years. They have a legislated net zero target, a mandate additional target. So their target for 2030 is 68% emissions reductions. So, they've already put out their 2035 target, again, because it's mandated under their legislation, and they're filling in policies underneath that to get there. And they're going to hit, full EV car sales by 2030 for light vehicles. They're doing amazing things because they have a mandated target and mandated process, all legislated. That's essential. I mean, same can be said in WA, which is just an aspirational net zero target that allows more gas projects to open up.
Yeah. And the other great thing about the UK situation is that it has bipartisan support, which is something we can still dream about in Australia, perhaps.
That's right. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess also, how can we turn climate into a positive issue now and kind of get some traction from COP26? So in the lead up to the next election, talking about a friendly race to zero instead of the attitude that seems to prevail of how little can we get away with doing. So how do we get that? What they want in the UK.
Joyce, you hit the nail on the head. You hit the nail on the head there, Joyce. Like, if you look at how the UK emits less than Australia, right? It has more than twice the population, emits less than Australia, and it's leading this whole process. And they're trying to get the best possible outcome here, and Australia's just trying to get away with it. Trying to get away with doing as very little as possible. So how do we change that? If you talk to Labor, they're saying that the government had until COP26 to put out their policies, and they have to the election. So that's the sort of different window that they're looking at. So they're thinking about what they're going to be putting forward as an opposition, which is much needed. We need a contest of ideas, and therefore we need ideas to contest. So the federal election will provide an opportunity to improve things, and we know through Climate of the Nation 2021, which is our annual survey, that 75% of Australians are concerned, 82% want coal-fired power station phase out, 60% want no new coal, no new gas as part of our net zero pathway. So there's strong appetite to do more. The majority of Australians want to see a levy placed on fossil fuels that feeds into paying for impacts to climate change. So we know that those exist. And really, there's an opportunity off the back of COP26, off the momentum of COP26, to do more. Hopefully, the federal election provides that window. And obviously, the work of CCL is a key part of that, in reminding politicians of the popularity and the broad support for more action. And I think in WA, with the massive swing from the last 8 elections, it's looking good in terms of actually trying to lobby from that end of the country for more action.
That contest of ideas, though, is hard, isn't it, for Labor, because they will want to keep themselves a bit of a small target this time round, perhaps?
Yeah. Yep. They'll probably think that the election will be lost by Morrison rather than necessarily won by them. It is hard. The pandemic has ensured that if you're an incumbent and you don't Trump bugger up the rollout of the solutions, then you'll come back, and you'll come back with strength. So, but having said that, just in the last couple of weeks, Morrison's caused one of the biggest diplomatic incidents we've ever seen. So, not sure really how it'll play out, but certainly if you look at news poll, he's down. He's behind, seriously behind. So, I doubt there'll be an election this year. Or necessarily very early next year.
Richie, you mentioned the role of Matthias Cormann, and but I'm going beyond him to the OECD. I'm interested to know how strong the OECD is on pushing for better climate policy, and in particular the carbon price that Cormann is talking about.
Yeah, it's hard. The OECD's faced a fair bit of resistance internally on a few of their policies. They were also trying to phase out coal power financing. We're facing resistance from Australia and others in terms of doing that around export financing and development financing. And then the work around carbon pricing, again, also faces a bit of resistance from similar individuals as well. So you can assume which countries are behind the scenes pushing back. And then also the rhetoric around we need a global carbon price is often used by corporations like Woodside to delay action. And that's the real concern, is when decent policies are used as delay tactics. And so look, it's good to have the OECD kind of trumpeting from there, but you kind of, I don't know, how hollow does it seem when Matthias Cormann is leading that call? So it's a tough one. It's a tough one. Having said that, the government also stitched up a deal with PNG in Fiji around a regional carbon offset scheme. So, you know,
Sure.
if you're creating, like, basically it's like, you know, whether you want to call it or not, you're basically creating a carbon price in a regional bubble, given that we will harmonize our carbon offsets through whatever is generated from there, because it'll definitely be cheaper. Much like when Australia connected up its gas to the LNG global market, then our gas prices went up, at least on our corner of Australia. So like it's, you know, so like there are things afoot. I think for when I think about carbon pricing, the kind of the sneaky way that it's going to be established is really through a carbon market and offset markets.
Yeah. Good. Well, Richie, one last question is just, are there some things that you're looking forward to in the next few days of the COP that you think might be creating something new or exciting in terms of climate policy?
Yeah. So the way that the UK presidency is organised is there's different themes to the different days of the COP, and so Transport Day is coming up, which I'm quite excited about, because if you try and do transport in Australia, it's like either the government's trying to trash it, is it ruining our weekend, or the state governments like Victoria and New South Wales and South Australia are trying to tax EVs. So it's this insane space to be on the East Coast trying to push clean transport solutions. And yet here, countries are racing to ban the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles. So I'll be excited to see what that looks like. You know, Norway is going to get to 100% new car sales are electric by 2025, like 4 years from now. You know, so that's cool. Like, you come here and you can recharge because you're like, oh wait, the rest of the world is not insane. That's cool.
Yes.
Like, yeah, and so there's some stuff on transport, on gas and oil, and tackling that head on. And also on what the carbon market will ultimately look like when it does get teased out, which is exciting as well.
Well, make sure you bring some of that recharge back home with you, and hopefully it'll rub it off here in Australia, and we can build on it. So, thank you very much, Richie, for joining us this morning. My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Richie.
Cheers.
Recording stops. So thank you very much, Richie. I think that went really well, and yeah, it was good, very good.
Richie, I wanted to ask you something on a. Can I just ask Richie one thing?
Sure.
What's it like to be? You haven't got a strong Australian accent, but what's it like to be an Australian in this situation in Glasgow in COP26? I mean, is there any pushback or any kind of like ragging, you know, that goes on?
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah, it's odd. Like for the first time I've been coming on and off to these things since 2007, and the first time Australia's ever had an actual physical pavilion here, like in the big floor of the conference. And so it's odd, like so like I was hanging out there, and I ended up having a chat to Malcolm Turnbull, and then Julia Gillard walks past, and she's like, oh, I thought I'd come and check out the Australian pavilion as well. She's here doing some stuff with climate and health, and Malcolm's doing some stuff with hydropower. And because there's this place for Australians to congregate, and also quite good coffee, like even where they are spruiking Santos and ridiculous stuff around carbon capture and storage, it's kind of like actually really nice having an Australian focal point, even if it is like shameful what they're doing. So it's this really weird hybrid where, and also I used to work with a lot of the people who are now like schlepping for these companies. So it's a weird mix. It's kind of like you got a bit of that, like, oh, like we're the Australians here, but then it's like, but I really dislike what you're doing. Like, it's such a poor way of representing Australia. I think there's been a good amount of pushback on that, which is good. And I think the Australian government has struggled to land any clear and positive messages here. Like the pavilion is seen as what it is, which is just a marketing tool in the absence of integrity and policy. And so I think that's been good. We've had some good gotten in there on that. I mean, I don't know, and I'm a bit seasoned in terms of having to name and shame Australia.
Yes. Well, it's easier from the outside than inside the tent, I guess.
Yes, I yes, that's exactly right, Rod.
Cool.
Great. Okay, well, I hope you enjoy the rest of the day and you find that good coffee fairly soon.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. The weather looks horrendous, but I'm hoping to maybe use the day tomorrow to get to Edinburgh.
Oh, lovely.
Lovely.
Beautiful.
Lovely.
I don't know, have you guys been to Scotland?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, just a couple of years ago. I loved it. Yeah, it was beautiful.
Yeah, well, that's my aspiration to get there. So, fingers crossed, we'll see. Actually, like I was hanging out with David Pocock, who's a footy player who's here as well.
Yep.
There's a footy game Australia versus Scotland tomorrow, so we might go see it.
Oh, that's good.
Great.
It's good to
Great.
brighten things up a bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
If you go out for a drink, you have to learn to say Slajavar. That's the.
Oh,
I've got the Scottish heritage, so I learned that word a long time ago.
there you go. Yeah.
Cheers.
Yeah. Good. All right. Well, I'm pretty sure after I've had one drink, there's no way I could ever say that.
You'll probably be able to pronounce it better after you've had a drink.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
That's right.
All right. All right. We'll go one in first then.
great. Well, thanks a lot, Richie. We'll
My pleasure, guys.
play back the recording tomorrow.
Great. All right. Have a great conference.
Thank you.